Now let's talk about the order for teaching, okay? Again, all students, starting at the beginning of the year, every year, they'll work their way through steps 1 through 11. Now, I'm going to show you the scope and sequence again for just a moment. And you'll notice 1 through 11, that's when we transition to the WISE Guide. The rest of these steps, this is all the rest of the program. And I use an analogy. I have a handout on my website, and I have no idea where my graphic is for that. It's if you go to one of the pages on the website and find the search box, you can look for roadmap. And I have a great handout there, and I use the analogy of you're going to take a road trip. Okay, and all these other topics that we're learning, they're kind of like the stops. You're on a big road trip and you're going to pull off. And like several years ago, my family took a road trip across the United States, and we pulled off to look at Mount Rushmore, or we went to the Grand Canyon, or we went to the Ingalls Homestead for Little House on the Prairie up in South Dakota. So all these little stops. We went to Niagara Falls, and so all those little stops that we made along the way are kind of like when you're teaching, and the main highway is the spelling list, okay? And all the little detours that you're going to make are like the visit, let's go look at, instead of Mount Rushmore, let's call it Silent Finalese. So we need to get off the highway for a moment and go learn about Silent Finalese. And what happens is when you get back on the highway, guess what came up in the spelling list? Silent Final E words. So that's why we had to take that little detour, okay? So when you're teaching a student, I'm talking about the order for teaching. When you're teaching a beginner, you're going to teach steps 1 through 11, just like I showed you, okay? And then step 12 is to get to the spelling list. And when you're teaching a beginner, the order that you're going to make all those little detours, all those little stops, first of all, you're following the WISE Guide. Once you get to the WISE Guide, all the instructions for when you need to take those detours are right there in your WISE Guide. It's kind of like your WISE Guide is your trip itinerary, and it tells you when you need to take those detours, okay? And that's when you come back to this book, you read that section, you practice it in your master teacher's log, and then you teach your student. So this scope and sequence, the way it's laid out here for you, is exactly that itinerary and the order that you would introduce them for the first time to your beginner student. All right, so we go to step 12, and then we start, when we're teaching spelling, we want to reinforce the words. We're going to expose the child to classic literature. I mean, we're just going to literally follow these steps. This is the sequence for how we teach a beginner. So in steps 1 through 11, we teach phonograms. Well, I already talked to you about how to teach phonograms in 2 different videos, okay? We teach penmanship if that's an issue. And so when you're teaching a beginner, you're going to focus on getting the phonograms with penmanship tied together, teach those together so it's very multisensory, okay? And once you get going with that, then you're going to get into teaching those key concepts on those reference pages. When you get to so step 9, I'm talking about steps 1 through 11. Step 9 is teaching the consonant and vowel page. Step 10 is to teach the multi-letter phonograms. For a beginner, I just teach the first 5 phonograms with list A. That's it. I do not have to teach all 70 phonograms in order to get started teaching this spelling. Okay, I'm just going to teach the first 5 phonograms along with list A. And then from that point on, I follow the instructions in the WISE Guide for when to introduce which phonograms. So by the time I finish list I1, I will have taught all of the 70 phonograms. Okay, and that's by the end of kindergarten. All right, now this is again teaching the multi-letter phonograms. That's step 10 in your spell to write read sequence. Step 10 with an advanced student, I'm going to introduce all of them at once. But then for both levels, I mean, that sounds like an awful lot of information for even a 3rd grader or a 4th grader. It is, and I don't expect them to remember that information. However, I expect mastery to come because we're going to practice every day. And I've talked about that in the 2 videos that I have already done. All right, so now let's talk about transitioning to the WISE guide. So when I get to step 12, I'm talking about with a beginner, step 12 is when I transition to the WISE guide, and now I'm ready to start spelling. And basically, I just follow the instructions in the WISE guide, and it will tell me when I need to take a detour. So let me give you an example. Silent Finalese is a perfect example. So I'm following along in the WISE guide, and I have taught lists A through C. Okay, so that's 60 words. If you're teaching kindergarten, that's 6 weeks, because I'm doing 10 words a week. If that's a first grade, that's 3 weeks. I'm doing 20 words a week. Okay, and I'll come back to pacing later. But now I'm getting ready to go into section D. And I look up here at my preliminaries, and I see the instructions to teach Silent Finalese. So I'm going to take a little detour before I get into my list D words. I'm going to take a little detour, and I'm going to go off and teach that concept. So you see, the instructions are right there. They tell me that I just follow the instructions in the WISE guide, and it tells me when I need to go off and teach something else. Okay, now let's talk about the advanced student. So I'm ready for spelling. I've taught steps 1 through 11. I've done my diagnostic test. I know where the student needs to start. I've taught the consonant and vowel page. That was step 9. I've introduced all of the multi-letter phonograms in one session, and I built the multi-letter phonogram page. Again, I don't expect the student to remember all that. I've exposed him, but I'm not expecting mastery by any means. All right, now I'm ready to start spelling. Okay, that is a really important page. When you get into your books, there's a page in here that's part of step 11, and some people forget to look at this. Okay, it's on page 65, and there's a little chart there that shows where to start based on how the student did on the diagnostic test. So my starting point for an advanced student, 2nd grade or above, is anywhere between lists J and T. I do not want to start somewhere between A and J. We hear people all the time, oh, I started at D this year. No, you don't start at D. You either start at A, like a beginner student would, or you're going to start at J, list J in the book. Anywhere between J and T is an okay place to start. And you've determined that based on the diagnostic test. Now I'm ready to jump into spelling. I've got my advanced student, and I need to know, can I just start teaching spelling? Like I did for remember the beginning student, I got steps 1 through 11 done. I'm ready to jump into spelling, and I just start, I teach those first 5 phonograms. That was part of step 10, but now I'm ready to get into spelling, and I just start with list A. Well, that's because you've given that student the preliminary information he needs to start at list A. However, when you're starting at list J, K, L, P, T, whatever, there's might be other information that student needs before you can actually teach those lists. Okay, and some people think, oh, I have to go back to the beginning with my advanced students. I have to start at A because I don't want to miss all those steps. This is how you're not going to miss them. Okay, so let me explain. I'm going to use a student who is starting at L as an example. So we're going to take list L as an example. So now I'm ready to get into spelling. I've done steps 1 through 11. I'm ready to start spelling. I go to my preliminaries in list L. And I look up here, and I see, what does my student need before I can teach this list? Okay, so I look at it, and I see that I need to teach the consonant vowel page. Oh, well, I did that. That was step 9. I need to introduce the multi-letter phonograms. Did that. That was step 10. Oh, it also says I need to teach the Silent Finalese. Oh, I haven't done that yet. Okay, so now my detour for Silent Finalese is before I've even gotten on the road. I have to make sure that I teach that, because otherwise my kids aren't going to know how to do the words that are in list L. Okay, so that was necessary before I taught that. And then also on that preliminaries, it also lists the eavesdropping rule. So I'm going to teach Silent Finalese and a quick introduction to the eavesdropping rule. Boom, I am now ready to start list L. Okay, I didn't have to teach everything else that was on that scope and sequence, because I'm going to show you something. Silent Finalese, that's step 17. So I jumped from 12 up to 17. And then eavesdropping, that was also something I had to introduce. That's over here in step 29. I'm taking these out of order. That's right. Why is it a different order for the advanced student? Well, the rules are introduced on the whole program for everybody. The rules are introduced on an as-need-know basis. As need know. So, for example, back to my beginners, when did they need to know the silent final A's? Before they went into list D, because guess what? In list D, silent final A words show up. How about my advanced student? I'm starting at L. Guess what? They have to know that before I can teach any of the spelling words, because there's silent final A words in list L1. The beginning of list L, they need silent final A's. So that's why I need to teach that then. So keep in mind the rules are taught when necessary. I've had a few people this last week tell me that they were drilling their kindergartners on the rule cards. Don't need to do that. Don't need to do that. In fact, we don't bring the rule cards out for a beginner until they have been introduced to all of lists A through F. So A, B, C, D, E, F. That's 120 words. They will have gone through 120 words in the spelling list before you ever show the rule cards. So we don't need to show the rule cards from the beginning. We bring those out after the student has been exposed to rules. It's not that they're not learning rules. We're not going to look at the cards because we want them learning the rules, hearing it, repeating it, learning how to memorize them, and using the rules in the process of the spelling lesson before we ever show them the visual. Okay? And I do the same thing with older students. I go for about 6 weeks before I ever show the rule cards. All right? So, but when do I teach those rules? As I need them. When they come up in the spelling list, that determines when I will introduce them. And so how do I know? Because the scope and sequence here that's laid out in the book, this is for a beginner. How on earth am I going to know when those rules need to be introduced for an advanced student? I follow the WISE guide. The WISE guide is going to tell me. So I started L. It told me what I needed to do at the beginning of L. I teach those 2 extra pages, and now I can jump into spelling. And then from here on out, I just follow the instructions of the WISE guide. So that scope and sequence, I'm just not doing it in the same order, but I'm still covering all of those concepts. And if you start anywhere between list J and T, you will hit them all. You do not have to bore your student and go back to low-level vocabulary that they already know how to spell because you're afraid you're going to miss a concept. You won't miss it. You're just going to hit it at a different order than you would had you started at the beginning. So please don't put your student who, is spelling at a 4th, 5th grade level, don't put them back in 1st grade and then say, well, they're not making progress. Well, that's because you're not teaching them words that are at their level. Okay, so let's keep the kids at a level of challenge that is helpful for them.